Yeah, I might as well get started. This is the image which you've been looking at on a poster the last few weeks, and this is the image, or this is what I'm going to talk about today. It's a book that came out 2006 with MIT Press. It's coming out this year in Romanian and hopefully other languages. But to be honest, a lot of people don't understand this book. And it's an interesting book because my friends in Hong Kong refer to my work as a kind of deep-fried theory, a bit like fish and chips from England, but the theory version of fish and chips. And whereas last week I was talking in a kind of flippant way about material from Millennium culture, which is a kind of popular culture operating on the surface level about a surface culture. This is actually an attempt to understand it in more detail. And it was written actually at the same time, but it took longer because this is a serious book. Now, just in case you're worried, you're not going to get the deep fried theory from me today. You're just going to get some of the kind of overview of the whole book. It also, I think, confused a lot of people, partly because although it appeared on the architecture shelves, it only mentions two buildings. And the kind of discourse in which it engages, which is basically psychoanalysis, the world of Freud, Lacan, Zizek, and certain critical theorists, Walter Benjamin and Adorno in particular, and Kristeva, is something totally remote from architecture. And the reviews that were most positive, and there were some very positive ones, came from guys from literary theory and philosophy, and some of the guys from architecture were totally bemused. But anyway, never mind. It's a serious book, and it's a book that tries to readdress some of the things which I've in a sense overlooked in the last few lectures anyway, and tries to create a kind of dialectical balance in addressing those issues. But before I talk about the book itself, maybe I'll just say a few words about the illustrations in the book. Actually, it's a very beautiful book. I mean, that's mainly because of MIT Press, who produced it and laid it out in a very beautiful way, but also because of the photographs, all by Francesca Woodman. Each section is introduced by a photograph of hers, and I had to get permission from her parents. In order to reproduce that, I had to send them actually a few chapters of the book before they would let me use their daughter's photographs. I should say that Francesca Woodman is I guess she's the kind of Sylvia Plath of American photography. Sylvia Plath was a famous American poet who came to my country, came to Cambridge, to my city in fact, to study, met Ted Hughes, who became the poet laureate, and they got married, had 2 kids, then they separated and got divorced, and shortly after that, she committed suicide tragically, but not after producing, not without producing some of the most exquisite poetry that I know. And likewise, Francesca Woodman committed suicide tragically early, at the age of 22, but not without producing an amazing body of work for someone who was so young. She trained in RISD, and she had a scholarship to Rome and took many of these photographs in Rome. What marks out her photographs are partly the fact that she always photographs herself. She's always the subject of her photographs. And partly also the fact that she photographs herself, at least in this series of photographs, in a kind of context of a building, in a context in the sense of becoming building. You can see, for example, on this particular photograph how this kind of fish, herringbone fish, the fish bones echo in some way the reinforcing, herringbone reinforcing in the plaster work here. And a lot of it is about this kind of sense of loss of self, of becoming part of a building. Wrapping herself with wallpaper, a loss of self, which I chose because partly because of the kind of anonymity of the photographs themselves. They weren't about particular styles of architecture, types of architecture, and I wanted to leave this book in a slightly sort of timeless way floating, as it were, and also because they very evocatively represent in a certain way what the book is all about the way in which we can become building, the way in which we can identify with buildings, become part of buildings, associate with them, the way that they themselves become part of our own identity. So a lot of the images then, the images in the book are about this. They're all about Francesca Woodman hiding behind things, playing hide and seek. There's a wonderful comment in a section on Walter Benjamin about children. Children hiding when they're playing hide and seek and becoming part of what they're hiding behind. So they hide behind a door and become part of the door. They hide behind a table, under a table, and they become part of the table. They need, when someone comes to find them, they need to sort of somehow give out this shriek of self-delivery in order to escape from being trapped in their situation. Otherwise, they are fixed forever in this condition. So a lot of the work is coming out of this very beautiful, evocative descriptions of Walter Benjamin's about a way in which we can identify with the world itself. And I would just briefly say, not to get into much detail, but the original starting point for the book really was a comment that comes in Freud's Book of Jokes on the theme of mimesis, how you pronounce it, where he talks about how we identify with someone in a joke. If there's a joke about someone slipping over banana skin, for example, he will say that the way in which we identify with that person slipping over banana skin is by putting ourselves in the position of that person and recalling bodily memories of what it's like to slip in a context of banana skin, but at the same time distancing ourselves enough from that person in order to be able to laugh at the joke. And he makes this comment, he says that if this has got real potential in the aesthetic realm if someone were to develop it as an aesthetic theory. So I try and pick up on that, particularly the work of the French or the German aesthetic philosopher Theodor Adorno, and try and develop a kind of theory of mimesis that kind of connects with a lot of other ideas that are in other theorists that kind of interconnect in an interesting way and overlap and together form a constellation, a non-totalizing constellation of ideas about how we can identify with our environment. So, and children are the ones who have this amazing capacity, according to Benjamin, to lose themselves, to become part of the world around them. So the book is taking its kind of point of departure from some observations in psychoanalysis, especially about narcissism, about the theme of death, about paranoia, melancholia, and so on. There's a series of chapters in the book, none of which seem to relate to architectural discourse at all. Sympathetic magic, death, melancholia, narcissism, ecstasy, and so on. But ultimately, all eventually trying to sort of kind of come together to create a kind of theoretical apparatus to understand how design operates, and especially in the context of the question of beauty, the role of beauty, the role of design itself in order to make us feel connected with the environment. So it's an abstract book without reference to particular buildings, but referring to a series of background theoretical reflections that together hopefully provide the framework to think in a new way about architecture. But it's not very architectural, I should warn you. So part of the reason for writing it, and I apologize to most of the people who've been to all these lectures and have seen this image so many times, but is to counter the arguments in my earlier book, Anesthetics of Architecture. Just briefly to the few people who haven't seen this before, this kind of sums up the critique of the world of images, especially the world of images in a world dominated by computer screens and seductive advertising images. It might look like a fireworks display, but this is in fact, is the image of war. This is the first night of the activities in the first Gulf War. What look like fireworks are in fact missiles, anti-aircraft fire, bombs, and so on. And it's the fact that we can somehow see it as a beautiful image that points towards the danger of the image itself. And in a culture of images, in a culture of postmodern postmodernity, where everything is co-opted into images and commodities, there's a danger that we aestheticize. That's the term that's used by cultural theorists. We see things as images, and we lose sense of the social, political, and economic content of those images. The world becomes a proliferation of seductive images empty of content. So anesthetics was a really a kind of rather tough and uncompromising critique of contemporary culture, of the contemporary culture in which architecture is produced and in which architecture is somehow itself co-opted into a kind of glossy magazine world of architectural design magazines. And I speak as someone who yesterday finished an issue of architectural design, so I'm part of the problem in many ways. It was an uncompromising critique that was arguing in a rather undialectical way, because I was somehow repressing the other side of the argument in order to make the argument more polemical, in order to make it more forceful. And there is, I think, some side of it which I think is absolutely correct. This notion that I was trying to put forward, that architectural culture had been dominated by an escapist kind of fantasy outlook that prevented architects from really engaging with the world as it actually was, because this obsession with beautiful images is something I think was not only a problem that is really endemic in contemporary architectural culture, but has been there from the very beginning. And this is an image of Piranesi, his prison, which of course is not really a prison, it's the carceri, it's a kind of romantic labyrinth. And this kind of danger of romanticizing things, of escaping from reality, is something I think there's been there, that is part of any, I think, poetic, artistic culture. Nonetheless, we are architects, and we have to deal with images. We have to deal with. We have to find a positive way of dealing with those images. And I guess one of the starting points was to think not just simply about the French post-structuralist thinkers, postmodernist thinkers like Jean Baudrillard, but also other thinkers such as Frederick Jameson, the American Marxist thinker, who kind of has the same critique about contemporary culture, at the same time somehow has a more balanced view. In Jameson's terms, everything is, as I said, co-opted into images and commodities, but nonetheless, the image is somehow, the world of aesthetics is somehow Janus-faced. It's both the source of our problems and also potentially the way out. For Jameson, he's kind of interesting. Let me just say, it was a brief sort of detour. LA features quite heavily in Frederick Jameson's kind of discourse, because it was at the Westin Bonaventure Hotel that he starts talking about architecture and starts engaging with architecture. His concern is that in a kind of our contemporary culture of late capitalism, everything has become homogenized, everything's become placeless, we lack a sense of where we are. And he uses the example of the Westin Hotel down in downtown LA to talk about how you go into the place and you've got no sense of where you are. You're completely cut off from the street, everything is totally symmetrical, you've lost your bearings. And this is a problem for Jameson as a Marxist thinker, because you lack a kind of a way of productively engaging with the world. And one of his central theories is about what he calls cognitive mapping, about how we find our place in the world. And he therefore was interested in not only how architecture manifests this lack of placelessness, but also how it might be a tool to find our place in the world. And that led him to engage with, first of all, Kevin Lynch, who wrote that book, Image of the City, I think it's called, which he soon dismisses as being totally banal. He thought it was about reading architecture, and eventually discovered it's simply about legibility of architecture. But then goes on in a more sophisticated way to deal with Kenneth Frampton, his discourse on critical regionalism, and has a very interesting essay which I reproduced in Rethinking Architecture, in which he critiques Frampton's take on critical regionalism in a very insightful way. I won't go into that now, but what he's looking for, basically, Jameson, is thinking about how the aesthetic realm can actually help us, can allow us to find our place in a placeless world. What he seems to be saying is that what we need now is a viable form of aesthetic expression that reinserts the individual into society. And so he's looking for what that might be, and I guess my book was taking a kind of its starting point also from that, trying to think about how aesthetics, how design could allow us to find our place in the world, not in the kind of what I seem to be a very kitsch way that Frampton's talking about in terms of having a certain building in a certain place, but how design itself, how in fact beauty could be a way of allowing us to find our place in the world. So the next issue, the reason why I wanted to kind of address this kind of question was the issue of beauty itself, the kind of the B word, the forbidden word in architectural discourse. And it's kind of interesting that nobody mentions beauty ever, at least apart from the gay guys like Nigel Coates, who's got no problems talking about beauty. But most architects, I don't know why it is actually, I don't know, maybe it seems to be too effeminate to talk about beauty, I don't know, but nobody does. If you talk to guys who were part of this office, Foreign Office architects, they say, well, you know, we all know our buildings are beautiful, but we're not allowed to say it, as though it's some kind of taboo subject. And the first version of my book, Camouflage, came out as an essay in a book about OMA, what is OMA, and the title was Camouflage, where the letters AMO are in brackets, but part of the word, obviously, of camouflage, and where I was critiquing Raymond Koolhaas and the way in which, in a certain, let's say, process-based diagrammatic design culture, especially in Holland, there is a kind of somehow a fear of addressing questions of beauty. It happens in London as well, especially the Architectural Association. The students are doing this kind of analysis of a site in an incredibly systematic and rational way, and not dealing at all with questions of beauty. Meanwhile, the diagrams themselves are exceptionally beautiful. And it happens also in my studio, as my students will know, trying to avoid the question of beauty, but it always kind of creeps in an interesting way. In a debate a couple of years ago at the Architectural Association, not a debate, a kind of a discussion between Peter Eisenman and Rem Koolhaas, Rem seemed to be kind of slightly unnerved by the fact that Peter Eisenman kept on saying to him, "But your buildings are beautiful," and he was trying to think about them in terms of kind of datascapes, in terms of data collection, as though architecture really stepped outside all these questions and simply a question of just simply producing something that was a kind of rational, objective exercise. Well, in some ways, it's not, and it's always there. Last night we were looking at some of the work coming out of the MTech group at the Architectural Association, a group that's kind of interested in performativity, in structural performative concerns and so on. And if you look at the architectural designs that came out, that they produced, all about processes and performance and things, but nonetheless the images they will choose from nature and whatever else, they're always exquisite images. So there's a kind of like a problem about dealing with the question of beauty in contemporary culture. And in fact, it's not simply in contemporary culture that we have a problem of dealing with beauty. Adolf Loos, as you will remember, wrote this tirade against ornament, against the sensuousness of ornament, ornament and crime. And if you were to kind of believe it's an interesting essay because he kind of uses the theme of the tattoo, and anybody who's got a tattoo, he would claim, any contemporary person with a tattoo, is somebody either who is in prison or should be in prison, who is somehow seen as criminal. He addresses it. For him, it's kind of like almost like architecture is simply to be understood in terms of function. Art has absolutely no place in that world. There is an interesting response to this by Theodor Adorno, an essay called Functionalism Today, which is in Rethinking Architecture, in which he kind of unties and unpicks Adolf Loos's position and exposes the kind of undialectical nature of his discourse. There is, according to Adorno, nothing that is so functional that is lacking any aesthetic content. Equally, there's nothing so aesthetic that it lacks any functional purpose. So he looks, for example, at dance and the kind of social function of dance. But he also exposes how in Adolf Loos's own work there is an incredible kind of luxury, incredible ornamentation, a seductiveness in a way of not only of materials, the use of marble and fur and other things, but also the kind of sensuousness of the round planning, the three-dimensional kind of manipulation of space. And what he basically says is actually if Adolf Loos actually really meant what he said, he would not actually produce the exquisite work that he produced. And the same could be said, I think, for Le Corbusier. I mean, if you took him literally at his word, you would never find something like Ronchamp or any of that kind of work that is really exquisitely beautiful in its own kind of way. So there's an interesting kind of problem at the heart of architectural culture, a kind of denial of something, an inability to address that question. So I was interested in addressing it in a way not from a kind of conventional conservative viewpoint, and I guess people like Heidegger have begun to sort of have laid out one way of thinking about it, but I find Heidegger far too right-wing, and I'm interested as a kind of old-fashioned European left thinker to try and construct an argument about this from a left-wing position. So on the one hand, what I'm saying is anesthetics, I think, is kind of right, the kind of left-wing critique of images, de Baudrillard and so on, as being aestheticizing is absolutely on the ball. But on the other hand, there is another side of beauty, a social role of design, shall we say, to give people a sense of place. Camouflage. First of all, I should say that what I'm talking about is not literal camouflage, and I think the title's a problem. It was at the AA when I was talking about these things. It was the most popular course. Everybody signed up for it, which is annoying because actually the ones who just had camouflage kind of trousers thought, oh, that's a course for me. And the serious ones couldn't get onto the list because they were too slow. So after that, I decided to call any of my courses had the word ontological and a few kind of complex philosophical terms in it. So only the kind of theoretical guys would go for it. So it's not about just camouflage outfits and things. It's, in fact, in many ways, what it's talking about ultimately is not so much it's talking about as much about these kind of military camouflage outfits which obscure people in the battlefield as, say, the kind of outfits of those guys in front of Buckingham Palace who are wearing those ridiculous kind of furry hats and the kind of red outfits who are kind of standing out from their background. What it's basically talking about is a sense is if camouflage itself has become a form of clothing, then all clothing is a form of camouflage. It's about dressing up in a kind of certain way in order to relate yourself either by standing out or blending in with your environment. And the question about dress then extends to all issues of design, going from jewelry at a very small level to urban design itself. It's about the potential connectivity that the aesthetic realm might give us to connect us with the life world in general. Let me just give you, okay, that sounds very theoretical. Let me just give you a simple example, a very, very simple example that sums up the whole book. If you are to, say, go walk into your favorite jazz club, I've got this particular favorite jazz club in Barcelona, the Harlem Jazz Club, you go in there and they're playing your favorite jazz, or it could be any form of music, right? And it's that moment you step into that room and you somehow feel totally connected. And it's kind of thinking about, okay, if that happens with music, how does that happen with design? How does design allow us to feel connected to the world? So in a sense, while it's not about camouflage itself, in the context of literal camouflage, it does pick up on two aspects of camouflage. First of all, the privileging of the visual, and secondly, as it's a kind of strategy of survival. What the suggestion is basically is that human beings are essentially creatures who privilege the visual over other senses. If you compare a human being to a dog, for example, a dog has got a far greater range of hearing or smell than a human being, but humans actually have got quite a privileged sense of the visual. So it's about the visual domain primarily, but not totally. And secondly, it's about survival. It's about how through design we can somehow survive, find our place in our world, in a world which is constantly fragmenting and losing all the ways in which we used to achieve a sense of belonging through the family, through the home, through religion, and so on. It's looking to how the aesthetic domain might give us that sense of connection. So these images now are all of creatures which are kind of seemingly camouflaged against their background. You can hardly recognize this, but this is in fact a shrimp, which has got a tactic of surviving through being transparent. And there are any number of examples in nature of creatures that, as it were, blend in with their environment or seek environments in which they will blend in. And the argument basically is that this is, of course, the case with human beings as well. The book starts with a description of a film by Woody Allen called Zelig. And I don't know if you know the film, but it's one of the most beautiful films by Woody Allen. It's a story of a 1930s Jewish immigrant in New York who has this astonishing capacity to blend in with those around him. So you put him in a room full of black jazz musicians, and after about 5 minutes, he's become a black jazz musician. Put him in a room full of red Indians, and he's turned into a red Indian. And he becomes in the story a kind of freak of nature who's kind of like he becomes part of a kind of a traveling circus because of his capacity to literally become and be like everyone else. And eventually there's some psychiatrists in white coats come and examine him. And of course, after about 5 minutes, he turns into a psychiatrist himself and starts examining them. But it's a very beautiful story about somebody who always wants to be and become like someone else. And I guess the point is, it's not that as though he was such a freak, because we're all like that. We all want to sort of be and become like other people. When I was talking about these things when I was teaching at Columbia, my students were very indignant and said, "But hold on, we are architects. We're highly original individuals. We don't copy anyone." So I told them, next time you're in the elevator going from the seminar room in the basement up to the computer room on the top floor, have a look around you and tell me who's not wearing black. And of course, the only person who's not wearing completely black is Bernard Schumi, who wears black and a red scarf, and everyone teases him mercilessly because he wears a red scarf. So the idea that architects are original, when they're all basically copying what OMA did in their recent design, or FAO or something, Foreign Office Architects, and is a complete myth. Well, so what I essentially was trying to think about was the way in which we as human beings we kind of always seek out, in some ways, want to relate to our environment. We want to sort of seek out the familiar. When we go to swimming pool, for example, I also always go to get the same locker, the same number locker. So it's my magic number. If I were doing I don't do lotteries and things, but I'm sure I picked certain sort of favourite numbers that had a certain purpose to me. I always go to my favourite bars. We have a kind of way of operating routines where we always seek out the familiar and familiarize ourselves with the unfamiliar. So this is is a defense mechanism. Adorno talks about this as a kind of defense mechanism of how we want to blend in and become like the world around us. A bit like a rabbit or something we catch in our headlights when we're driving at night. This idea of freezing and pretending that you become like the world around you in order to survive. You play dead in order to survive. And in fact, in many ways, I think Zelig was not really becoming like other people. He was playing it in order to survive. It was a kind of camouflage tactic, a kind of masquerade to present himself as though he was becoming like everyone else. But actually, it was a way of preserving his underlying identity. So in nature, you get plenty of examples of creatures which will conceal themselves, they will camouflage themselves, either to protect themselves or in order to attack their prey. A snake or a lion, for example, will maybe blend into its environment and wait for the precise moment before it attacks its prey. And perhaps the ultimate creature of the masquerade is the chameleon, a creature which actually has got an amazing capacity to see. I mean, if I speak about human beings as creatures that privilege the visual, well, the chameleon is the most extreme example of that. The chameleon's got no sense of smell, no sense of hearing, but the most exquisite visual apparatus. The chameleon is able to see 360 degrees in 3 dimensions. it has a kind of incredible pixelation, as it were, of the eye, the most refined sight of any creature. But interestingly, what is about a chameleon is it doesn't always want to blend in. A chameleon will either want to go green and blend in, or in certain moments when it's angry or when it's showing off its sexual prowess, it wants to kind of like it turns yellow in order to stand out from its environment. So here we have two chameleons having a fight, and the guy on the left is clearly winning, and the guy on the right is kind of is going green and is about to slink off and concede aesthetic defeat. This, for some reason, always reminds me of two women at a cocktail party glaring at each other because they're wearing the same dress. Whenever I say that, my feminist friends always attack me for saying it. So, anyway, but the thing about this chameleon is that it has developed this tactic of either standing out or blending in, but it's a way of kind of relating to the environment around it. And in moments of sexual prowess, I don't know if this is a moment of sexual prowess, but apparently it also goes yellow and stands out. Well, and here we have, oh, a shame, I forgot to put that video in there, but it's a mimic octopus. You get a lot of examples in nature of mimicry like that. So the question ultimately is fine, okay, so we all, as architects, we're not anywhere near as original as we think. We're all copying the latest expressions, we're humming the tunes other people are humming, we have the same haircut other people have, we're wearing the same kind of Puma shoes and the same outfits and things. We're all copying everyone else, right? So, but what's that going to do with design culture as such, and what's it going to do with buildings? Well, I want to sort of kind of like open up, because I'm not really talking about literal mimicry, about whether wearing something that's sort of black in a black room or whatever, but rather about the kind of the psychological apparatus, the way we think ourselves into buildings. So maybe if I can introduce this by, especially for the students here, well, in fact for all of us, because we all remember what it was like to be a student. If you imagine, for example, you're going on a trip somewhere, and somewhere in, I don't know, Greece or Turkey or somewhere, and you or South America, and you find yourself this super cheap grotty hotel for the night, and you go in there and you find this room, and it's sort of smelly and it's musty, and the paint is peeling from the walls, and this kind of drab furniture, and it's not very tidy, and you think to yourself, well, hold on a second, I was looking at that amazing design by Zaha last week in the architectural magazine. There's a hotel down the road, I could stay there, designed by Zaha. Then you realise actually that you can't afford to stay in the hotel by Zaha because it's $500 a night, and you've only got $50 or $25, and this is the only place you can stay, so you have to accept the fact you've got to stay in this grotty place. Well, that's what a situation we all know only too well, right? What's interesting, though, is that after a night or two staying in a place like that, you somehow gradually start kind of growing into it. You start getting familiar with it. You start becoming fond of the musty smells, of the shabby furniture, of the peeling paint, of the kind of the character of the place. And after a while, I mean, maybe after 2 or 3 days, you almost don't want to leave. You somehow become accustomed to it. You've grown into it. It's become part of you. And that's something that happens, I think, not just in sort of cheap, shoddy hotels, but moving into, say, a new apartment. When you first move into the apartment, you kind of like, it seems very unhomely, a bit sort of, you don't feel at home there, but after a while, by the time you've left, you're super fond of it, and it's become part of you. And that happens in even the most extreme examples. This is one of only 2 examples of architecture I'm going to show you today. This is Alcatraz, the former state penitentiary, now turned into a museum. And what's interesting about this building is that if you take the audiovisual guide around it, and I really recommend it because it's a fabulous guide, there are some comments by the former inmates about their relationship to their cells that are just fascinating. There's one guy, I mean, very articulate as well, one guy called Leon Whitey Thompson, who talks about his relationship to his cell, and he said that after a while, I got to know, just quote if I remember exactly, after a while I got to know every mark, everything in my cell, until like I became part of my cell and my cell became part of me, and I couldn't imagine going back to a different cell in the evening because it was like going back to an old friend. this sense of complete identification with the cell itself. There's another story, actually a very true story, that was told about Nelson Mandela. And I have a friend who has a friend, who's an architect, who was invited by Mandela to design a building for him immediately after he was let out of Powell Prison, the open prison in which he was kept under house arrest. Before that, he had been in Robben Island. Anyway, this architect, who obviously realized that thought this was the most amazing commission to be asked to design a house for one of the greatest individuals of the 20th century, was a little perplexed when Mandela came into the room with a roll of drawings. And he rolled out these drawings on the table, and he said to the architect, "I want you to design me something like this." And the drawings were the drawings of the house in which he'd been kept under house arrest, a single-story building. And to this day, Nelson Mandela lives in a replica of the house in which he was kept under house arrest, which is astonishing. What it begins to suggest is that it had become so much part of him that it was part of who he was. His identity somehow was locked into the space in which he had been living for so long. So what does this say about architecture? Is it that, we don't have to design anything special? We could design Alcatraz, we could design prison houses, and it doesn't matter because eventually everybody will get used to that space and will come to like it, come to identify with it. This is a question actually that Adorno asks, therefore it is important? Or is it their design not important because of that? And he says, no, precisely not. The point is this: if human beings have this tendency to want to become part of, to want to grow into, to want to assimilate to their environment, it's not that design is unimportant, but the opposite, design is precisely important in order to facilitate that urge. The role of design is to allow us to feel connected with our environment. Well, once you take all those things on board, this desire to become part of the world around you, and this capacity of human beings to assimilate, to adapt, in a kind of broader way, there are a number of interesting implications for architectural culture. First of all, you would abandon the kind of thinking that comes, the very conservative thinking comes out of the Heideggerian camp that tells us that technology is alienating. Well, how long is it alienating for? How long is it before we start getting attached to our computers, we start calling our cars names and so on? Equally, it would challenge the thinking that comes out of the more progressive camps, from people such as Bernard Schumi, who talk about how architecture should be shocking. Well, how long is this quaint old deconstructivist building shocking? How long before you get used to its kind of ramps and its other kind of forms? Equally, though, it points towards something I think really much more interesting in many ways about the kind of mutancy at the heart of the human imagination, the way in which human culture is continually mutating and changing and adapting and assimilating itself to new logics. And I think one of the things I found interesting is that the way in which you guys out there, the kind of you students, are kind of part of what I call a mutant generation. You've been brought up with a very different kind of set of values to a different technological world, especially to the way I was brought up. And I think the biggest kind of paradigm shift that's happened in the last few years was not in '68. It was not this kind of left-wing revolution that was going on in the streets of Paris. It was a technological revolution that has somehow generated a whole new generation that think completely differently. Walter Benjamin has this comment about how in the modernist factory, people begin to sort of absorb the logic of the factory, of the kind of mechanistic way of operating, and that becomes part of how they behave themselves. And one can begin to extrapolate from that the possibility of how, in the kind of fluid networking logic of a digital era, how that logic begins to pervade the kind of mentality of the people who are part of that. Equally, one can imagine how, in a culture of postmodernity, or even beyond postmodernity, whatever we're in now, how the kind of things that Baudrillard and Debord were worrying about this proliferation of images, how that's no longer anything to worry about at all, because the new generation has adapted to that in a kind of knowing way, just as Cindy Sherman had begun to sort of play around with the image in her photography. So, one can see how this new generation is not duped by this kind of world of images, but rather has taken that world on board and has learnt to sort of play with them in an imaginative way. So, Let me just take a few examples to try and explain in more detail the way that it's argued in the book itself. This is from a chapter on narcissism, and you probably all know of the myth of Narcissus, the beautiful youth from classical antiquity who was punished by the gods for spurning the advances of Echo by being made to fall in love with himself. Whether or not he knows he's falling in love with himself is a bit unclear, but what happens is he comes back from a day of hunting and is gazing at he takes a drink in a pond and sees his own reflection and is completely enthralled by it, and he can't snap out of it. He's just simply locked into this kind of this world, and eventually he turns to marble in a very architectural analogy and dies. And then when they come to find his body, they find instead this little flower, the Narcissus. Well, according to people like Freud, narcissism is a very negative thing. It's like a kind of childish delusion. It prevents you from seeing the other in the other. You continually see the self in the other, and it's negative from that point of view. Others, such as Herbert Marcuse, are more positive about narcissism, because one thing that's very clear is that Narcissus is in a state of existential oneness with the world. He's completely wrapped up in something. He's in a state of bliss. So there's something positive that comes out of this. But if we combine the kind of myth of Narcissus with another kind of comment that comes out of Freud, we can develop an interesting kind of thesis about Narcissus. According to Freud, the original architectural space, or the first architectural space that we ever experience, is the mother's womb. And the mother's womb Freud refers to it as the nirvana of the womb. It's a form of paradise. And the baby who is kind of floating there is in a complete state of bliss. I mean, the mother is kind of being fed by the mother, it's being kept warm by the mother, it's kind of floating around in this sea of amniotic fluid. And this is a paradise, according to Freud. The tragedy comes when one day suddenly the kid is ejected into this kind of horrible world. I mean, California's not so horrible, but can you imagine if you were kind of February or March in Northern Europe or in Canada, then you'd know what it means. I mean, it's cold out there. You know, you've got to look after yourself, you've got to feed yourself, you've got to keep yourself warm, you've got to go and write assignments, you've got to do design projects. You know, life is a nightmare. When we're ejected from this kind of paradise, and according to Freud, all subsequent life is premised on the regressive compulsion to return to the nirvana of the womb. We all want to be back in this kind of paradise and being fed and kept warm, and so on. If we take this kind of this comment about this notion of the womb as the kind of this archetypal space, this kind of paradise, and if we take also this kind of image of Narcissus, it kind of totally in a state of bliss, gazing at something that is kind of returning to him some aesthetic reflection. Let's perhaps take this image and think not about a two-dimensional mirror, but rather a three-dimensional space, a kind of in which one sees one's own aesthetic predilection reflected all around. Then you have something which in the book I refer to as an aesthetic cocoon. Imagine that in terms of a kind of designer space. Especially maybe you can afford to go to stay in an Ian Schrager hotel, for example, and you fly into New York or London or something, and you're jet lagged and exhausted, and you end up stepping into this kind of designer environment, and suddenly after the kind of the jet lag and the hassle of going through customs and whatever else, you find this sanctuary, in this kind of, and you suddenly kind of sink into this kind of blissful state of being totally at one with your environment, be surrounded by this kind of amazing kind of designer landscape. That's in a sense what I mean by a kind of aesthetic cocoon, the sense in which one can be so surrounded and so totally feel connected to kind of find a kind of sanctuary, some space in which you kind of lose yourself as a kind of a way of almost a survival tactic, in the sense of in a world in which we are otherwise continually in motion. So that suggests the possibility of an architecture, or at least a role of design, to kind of allow us to feel connected in a world which, as I mentioned before, in which other forms of connectivity to do with kind of social bonds, to do with the kind of fabric of the family in which divorce has become so prevalent, in which maybe structures such as the church are no longer quite as strong as they used to be. In a world of nomads, in a world of continual transiency, the possibility of design providing a kind of sanctuary speaks then of a kind of social role of design to find our place in the world. I'm going to skip this reference to Saint Teresa, but there is a chapter in the book on ecstasy which is about this loss of self, which takes on, in the context of Saint Teresa, a particularly erotic dimension. But I'll leave you to read the chapter on that to find out what that's all about. And I'm going to finish with just a brief discussion of going back to the world of insects, to a brief discussion that appears in the work of Deleuze and Guattari about a particular orchid and a particular wasp. It's a very beautiful story, although paradoxically Deleuze and Guattari omit the most interesting fact about this, which Reed found a very good video for, which I'm not going to show today. But the story basically is this, that there is a particular orchid which attracts wasps in order to basically transfer its pollen, like most plants. But it doesn't attract the wasp through the normal tactic of providing nectar. That would be too easy. It attracts wasps by posing as a female wasp. At least it looks vaguely like, and it certainly gives out the kind of the smell and other sensory indicators that dupe the male wasp into thinking that it's having that it's a female wasp. And what happens is that the wasp lands and it looks at this kind of shiny, velvety kind of whatever, and it starts having sex with it. That's what happens. The biologists refer to this as pseudo-copulation, and you can just Google the words wasp, orchid, and something else, and you'll find a very nice little video by David Attenborough, which will tell you all about this. It's not a myth, okay? They do this, and of course, after a while, the wasp kind of gets a little frustrated because it kind of thinks, well, hold on a second. Well, actually, I'm not sure if it really thinks it's a female wasp. It might just say, this was nice last time I tried it. Let's try it again. But anyway, let's assume it was thinking it was a female wasp. It lands there and says, hold on a second, there's something wrong here. I'm not quite sure what it is. But then it decides it's not satisfied. So it kind of flies off. And of course, while it's been kind of getting excited and rubbing itself up against this orchid, the orchid has been depositing pollen on the wasp. And the wasp then has this pollen on it, gets disappointed, flies off, finds another female wasp, also it thinks, and does the same again, and in the process transfers the pollen from one orchid to the next. I guess what's interesting to me is the image here of the wasp being housed by an orchid. It's therefore a kind of very architectural image in some way. And also, I think the notion of kind of like a temporary housing. It is a kind of housing in a strategic kind of sanctuary. It's a housing in an age of nomadology, in an age of nomadism. It's a kind of temporary housing of this whole thing. For Deleuze and Guattari, strangely, they don't refer in any way to the sexual side of things. I don't know why. But they do talk about the wasp and the orchid in terms of a sense of becoming. The wasp has become like the orchid, and the orchid has become like a wasp. It's a kind of process of folding into one another. As they've evolved over time, they evolved in order to kind of serve one another. In other words, what you begin to sort of see is that there's a kind of process of the wasp, of the self becoming the other and the other becoming the self, that echoes the way, for example, the prisoner in Alcatraz had become like his cell and his cell become like him. It echoes also in the context of Narcissus of seeing himself in the other and seeing the other in the self. So it suggests something about a kind of way, a kind of reciprocity, about a kind of technique of how one might become part of the other. What he doesn't refer to, though, is the context of how design might serve this. Adorno develops the notion of how design serves as a form of sensuous correspondence. It allows us, through a sensory regime, to kind of connect with the other. But Deleuze doesn't refer to this, nor indeed does Baudrillard or Benjamin in their discussion about aesthetics ever talk about the possibility of sensuousness, of differentiating certain sort of images and things. They can tend to blanket them all together, but it seems to me there is a necessity to go and see how some have a kind of certain powerful role to make us feel connected, some more than others. So what does this mean for architectural design? Does it mean that we should just go around designing orchids everywhere? Well, actually, what's interesting, firstly, is that these theorists, and I'm referring primarily to Adorno and people like Julia Kristeva, they don't refer to architecture at all when they're referring to these concepts. They're referring mainly to literature. They refer to the way in which one should be writing, and they contrast, for example, the kind of very technical language of, say, a manual of how you might fix your Volvo car with the writing of James Joyce. I mean, James Joyce's poetry is always cited as the kind of what they're referring to, a kind of a sort of language that allows you to kind of in an intuitive way somehow connect. The only time that they refer to a building, Adorno refers to Scharoun's Philharmonie, the Philharmonic Hall in Berlin, as an example of what he's referring to here. So there is some hint that it's about a kind of a language that is not unduly rational, perhaps, that allows us to feel connected. But they don't say it's about a style as such. It's not about. They refer rather to the way in which, at a certain age, there is a certain style that's developed. In the Baroque age, there's the Baroque kind of style of sculpture, of art, of architecture, related to the kind of values of that day, and that allowed people to connect. A few years later, it seemed kind of totally redundant, totally over the top, and was rejected. But at the time, it connected. So it's about us establishing a kind of way of thinking about architecture that is of the moment, that allows us to connect in a certain way. And it doesn't relate so much to questions of the curvilinear, of blobs or whatever at all. In many ways, what's interesting about this kind of thesis is that it's not about the language so much as the capacity to make you connect. So in other words, I was staying the last few years, I was working in Dessau, staying in the Bauhaus, in Gropius's building. And that's an amazing building. It's totally concrete, totally kind of rectilinear in a certain sort of way. And yet somehow amazing capacity to sleep at night, and it was an amazing place to feel at home in some ways. So it's not about the capacity of, say, soft furnishings to kind of make you feel cozy, nor is it about nostalgia, about the capacity of surrounding yourself with things like your grandfather clocks and things that would make you feel at home and cozy because they're so familiar. But it's about the possibility of design, whether Bauhaus style or indeed maybe orchid style, to allow you somehow to feel connected in some way. So it's about a kind of intuitive approach towards design that is, as it were, a kind of an architecture of let's say, of James Joyce. I'm going to finish with a. I'm going to finish before I was finish. Okay, finish off. I normally don't show any buildings, but I wanted to show this one because it was designed by one of my former students when she was working for Zaha, and we've been talking about many of these issues. And it doesn't have to be an architecture like this, but it's kind of interesting that this is a hotel room, that it's an architecture kind of based on a kind of sensuous language that somehow, I mean, I'm sure would be a fabulous place to stay the night. So let me simply kind of finish with this one image of a piece of architecture, which I shouldn't really have shown in the first place, but it's really about more talking about a sensibility of design, a way of thinking of design. But ultimately, what it's about is trying to articulate, and without today going into much detail about it, but to try and establish a kind of theoretical paradigm for understanding how, through certain sort of insights from psychoanalysis, from critical theory and so on, we can begin to kind of construct a theory of the social role of architecture that doesn't have to resort to the conservative right-wing thinking of people like Martin Heidegger. At the same time, it adds an important sort of dimension into a world in which we as a profession seem to be singly incapable of dealing with or talking about beauty and questions of the aesthetic, or indeed anything to do with the sensual in architecture. Okay, thank you. We got some time for some questions. Have you got some? I kind of sense this was very different to what I was talking about last week, and but it's not different at the same time. It's maybe a bit more kind of serious, sober reflection on some things.
Well, I think a lot of what you've been talking about has a lot to do with architecture and identity. And,
yeah.
You know, there's a lot of that, thinking about it in a way that we don't really talk about it the same way. You've actually touched upon some things that I think that we avoid talking about because we might think it's not authentic in terms of the way of making architecture.
Mm.
So I find it refreshing to hear about it in this way because it's something I did my master's thesis writing and stuff, so this is very interesting.
It's funny because I in London I'm supervising some guys at the London Consortium who are, I mean, that's a PhD program for philosophers, and it was because it's mixed. I mean, the Architectural Association is part of the London Consortium, along with the Tate Modern, the ICA, and so on. There's an interest in architecture for sure, and some of these philosophers are really fascinated by architecture because it is a kind of material expression that's so tangible out there, and it becomes a site of investigation. But one of the things they were saying was that there's one very, very smart student who was a first-class honours student from Cambridge in philosophy, and he said, listen, I've been reading all this architecture stuff, and it somehow doesn't add up, If I look at the text and I look at the buildings, it doesn't make sense. And I think that there is an interesting kind of mismatch between the discourse or the justificatory discourse that's used for architecture when you hear people presenting their designs and actually what's really going on, And I don't know why that is. Why do we talk through different, almost like decoy discourses in order to talk about the design itself?
Camouflage?
Yeah, maybe it's that. I don't know. It's really, but and it's. I mean, one of the issues ultimately is if you look back over his history, from the very beginning, from Vitruvius onwards, there's been a problem about talking about that question. I mean, Vitruvius famously talks about firmitas, utilitas, venustas, structural stability, functionality, and venustas, which is kind of charm and beauty. But what the interesting comment is that if you look through the history of architecture, what's the kind of language that's used to justify aesthetics? Throughout the Renaissance, it was always a moral one. It had to be appropriate, becoming, seemly, a kind of moral discourse. So moral terms were used. You hit the 20th century, and it's got to be somehow. It's a political one. It's got to be kind of democratic. It can't be totalitarian. It's got to be emancipatory, and so on and so on and so on. 21st century, it kind of seems like kind of maybe being colonized by environmentalism. It's got to be something else, It's almost like we can't really kind of deal with the thing that's at the very heart of our discourse. And I don't know why that is, to be quite frank. I mean, I think in some ways it is a kind of logic of repression in some ways. I mean, I think that the best example I could use, and the best example for kind of dismissing in a way Baudrillard as well, is the film American Beauty, where, I think I mentioned this before, where the principal protagonist, the guy who's homophobic, is the one who's gay in the end. That we're in a kind of state of denial about something and we can't talk about it. And I don't know why that is. I mean, that's really maybe the next book or something like that. But why is that? And so it's weird. And I think people who have come from outside architecture are totally bemused by that, the way we can't talk directly about what we do. Anyway, I'm just going to throw that out there as a kind of comment. But it is ultimately about identity and about the role that architecture plays in identity, which is not about giving architecture an identity. It's not about sort of making it. It's about the understanding the process by which we connect with that world and identify with that world and how it becomes part of us, and it does become part of us.
Which makes you wonder if narcissism is not so far away from.
Oh no, it is. I mean, I think the point about narcissism is every form of love is a form of narcissistic love. If you look at those I don't know if you know the cartoons by Louis Hellman, architects. He does. They're amazing. He does kind of drawings of Zaha based on a Zaha building, or drawings of Rem based on a Rem building, and they look like Rem. They look like Zaha. You can actually see. And there's a kind of James Sterling, but he's kind of big and stocky, and it's amazing how similar they are. And I think that principle of narcissism is written into everything else. When I went driving here today, there was a woman. I should be careful what I say here because I'll be who's being sexist, but she was walking her little poodles over the road, and the famous case of the dog looks like the owner, and the owner looks like the dog. I mean, it was so clear. So there is something interesting about narcissism. I mean, actually, if I'm very, very honest about this whole thing started off when I was in a Chinese takeaway shop in Cambridge, and I was waiting for my number 59, sweet and sour pork and rice or something. And I was looking at the local paper, and I just noticed that they had these kind of like the recent weddings and you looked at the bride and the bridegroom, and they both had the same nose or something. And I thought, there's something strange going on here. But and according to Freud, all forms of love are a form of narcissism in some strange way. So it's an interesting kind of question.
I think, real quick, I really appreciate the argument for these architectural attractors, and I like the sort of the performative component that you brought into it as well. And just in sort of situating it within a school, I just had a question, because you've been certainly dealing with these issues longer for quite a bit of time. Typically, or at least the way I went through school, we always, tell students, as an instructor, you tell students that intuition's not good enough somehow, and that you need to develop a sort of critique with the student and sort of a dialogue, right? And I'm wondering what you would sort of see as a kind of a future student-teacher dialogue with kind of intuitive process.
I don't know, and I'm as guilty as anyone in this kind of regard, because I'm the worst, okay? And my students would tell me, because everything is kind of like scripted or programmed, and I kind of tell them that everything's got to be an instruction. It's like, I think at the back of it, you have to accept and understand there is an underlying sensibility that is what we are as architects. But maybe I try and work on a more precise, rigorous thing. That is accepted. That's the background, and then it's a question of kind of being systematic in a different kind of way. That's a difficult question I don't know. I think all forms of writing tend to be autographical writing, so I'm kind of critiquing myself. Ask the guys at the back; they'll tell me I'm the worst at this. But it's I guess it's from my particular background, particularly the AA, where the AA and the Bartlett are such different schools. The AA was, the Bartlett's dominated by Peter Cook, and it's really about not theorizing anything, and slightly jokey kind of world of archigram, and you make beautiful objects. And I found out recently that Peter Cook really hated my book Anesthetics. He thought I was a Marxist killjoy and missing the point about architecture. Meanwhile, the AA, which I really like the AA. I think it's an amazing kind of place in many ways, but it was the opposite world of trying to really kind of work on performance issues and like working almost as engineers and things. But actually, of course, there was a kind of underlying sense of design that was fundamental to that. So, the DRL, they would produce all these exquisite diagrams. It was a diagramming culture, but the diagrams look beautiful. And it's kind of, it's there. You have to assume that's taken for granted there. But I can't answer that question. It's too close to what I'm guilty of myself.
Last week and this week, you were just saying you're not sure how they're connected. I'm wondering if they're connected. Well, the first way in which they're connected, you created a kind of a dialectical relationship. This today was this kind of mirroring, the kind of the kind of a plane of kind of meeting between two things where they're beginning to somehow mirror, merge, converge, camouflage, kind of reflective thing back and forth. Last week it was the real and the fake real, that kind of coming across. And maybe the performative is another way of trying to approach the same thing, or the generative this kind of thing. Is that, okay, if last week was being driven by a kind of a process of intentional, driven by marketing, commodification, intentional strategy to do the kind of thing that you're talking about this week, which occurs in kind of an evolutionary or kind of a natural process, then the performative and the other model that you're yourself so interested in maybe is a dialectical relationship to what you're saying last week, where it's, okay, we look at Las Vegas and we see as becoming an aesthetic point of view, it's like there's a kind of a crassness to that, but there's also a kind of energy in that dialectic. So how do we create kind of a more intentionally created process that essentially addresses that, but in a sense outside of it. I mean, do you see any connection?
Okay, no, they're both totally connected. I mean, but a different way. I mean, they were both about a dialectic. Ultimately, today was more about the self becoming the other, becoming the self, and last week it was about discussions about authentic and inauthentic, becoming, playing around with that in some way. But I mean, it was like, actually, Millennium Culture was written at the same time as this, but it was just simply done on a kind of totally surface level, where and it was done looking at surface culture deliberately, part because of what Krakow writes about surface culture. That is kind of, it reveals itself in a less self-conscious way. Therefore, it reveals more about the fundamental state of things. So it's a really interesting kind of insight. You can find out a lot more about American society by watching TV and going to Las Vegas than you can by looking at kind of deep intellectual debates. That would be the argument, right? So it was about that. But this was kind of I'm just kind of digging deep into the argument here. The model I always had was there's a guy called Slavoj Žižek, who's this psychoanalytic thinker that I'm really interested in. He's kind of works in this kind of same way, in a sense. He's kind of arguing about deep kind of philosophical ideas, but by using Hitchcock. And you got operate on the surface, then you dig down at some point and you start talking about some complex idea in Lacan, and you come up and refer to a Hitchcock movie. So it was kind of, they weren't so dissimilar. I mean, maybe it'd take a while to show how they're kind of similar in a certain sort of way. Although that was dealing with a popular culture, and this has been more serious, to be honest. I mean, this is much more serious. This is deep fried. That means it's a book which has got 400 pages and 150 which are footnotes. It's a serious kind of like theoretical thing. So it's a different type of discourse. But in the end, they are kind of connected in a way. So, but maybe I need to think about that and give you a better answer on that, because it's not so straightforward. They seem to be quite different, but they're not in the end. I think, and I guess there was something about fantasy that relates to both of those things. I mean, psychoanalysis is the crucial turning point. In other words, whether you deal with psychoanalysis in a serious way with footnotes and look at it in a certain way, that there's something there, or whether you simply use it in terms of a logic of a surface culture. Because while I was looking at all the work in Baudrillard, all the guys who I knew who were working on psychoanalytic theory were talking about how important images were and the surface was in terms of how we identify with the world itself. And it was a way of overcoming the Baudrillardian logic also, which is saying that there's somehow we've lost reality beneath the surface, whereas for Lacan, we don't engage with reality in the first place. It's all about the world of images and the kind of world of the fantasy, the realm of the fantasy, and how we perceive things through that. So,
well, in terms of like the example with the prisoner in the jail cell, or the making of the Disneyland, the making of Las Vegas, would you argue that it's kind of a making of the familiar at another scale? I mean, instead of the individual, it's more of a cultural scale. But in a sense, it's kind of the same thing of these are things that are, by bringing this kind of imagery, these kind of references to these places, it's a kind of sense of making a familiar context.
Yeah, I guess so. I would probably need to think through that question more and reflect upon it, actually. But it's. I
just wonder. I'm trying to wonder what is the underlying motivation for the kinds of tendencies for branding, marketing, commodification, producing a certain kind of product that you were referring to last week. What is the underlying tendency that's really generating that particular outcome? And it seems like it might be connected to a lot of what you were talking about today.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's about, in the end, branding is about seeing yourself in your Nike sneakers or something. In the end, it's about that in some way. So there is a connection, absolutely. But I guess it might seem totally different because the discourse was flippant last week, and it's very kind of serious now.
Right.
So, but there is a total connection. Let me think about that more.
Well, I'm just curious in terms of going forward, because like Reed and I, we stayed in this hotel.
Oh yeah.
And it was it was really kind of interesting. My daughter's main problem was she kept bumping her head into the wall because you can't see. You're like in a snowfield. And you can't see, and it's like you go from this hotel. Every room has like a different designer, right? It's like, and so then you do that, and you talk like you talked last week, and you think about it, and I guess the question is, how, I come back to the question of last week is the issue of paralysis. How do you move forward?
Yeah. I mean, we just say briefly in terms of the hotel. I mean, there's a problem in my whole argument. Let me just confess that. Okay, I'm assuming everybody has got the same aesthetic sensibility, but they don't. I mean, actually, there are different communities. I'm talking about a community of taste, but there are communities, say, of model railway people. They walk into a room full of model railways. That's their paradise. There are communities of guys who think Starbucks is paradise. There are communities of guys who, and so on. And actually, I have a friend who we went to a whole group from Zaha's. We went to spend a night in Vals at the Peter Zunter building. It's not really my design, but I really liked that place. It was great. And I thought everyone's going to love Peter Zunter. It's this amazing place. But actually, my friend Britta, she'd taken her parents to Peter Zunter's baths, and they hated it. They just didn't like it. It was too stark for them. So we can't assume that everybody in our contemporary culture is going to like this stuff at all. Although what I would say is I think one of the kind of benefits of postmodern culture is a kind of raising of aesthetic standards. So even though some people may be indignant that some architecture has been kind of co-opted into a world of kind of fashion and cookery and whatever else, actually it's raised its profile within the popular consciousness. If David Beckham, who is a kind of football player, is kind of seen as a fashion icon, then that kind of world has become more popularized by the media in a certain sort of way. So,
in our last lecture, the people for the 5th year who are here know this. Anik a couple of days ago did a lecture in which she presented like 10 or 12 buildings that are the ones that are kind of in this, the CCTV and the Zaha, et cetera. And we're looking at these things, which is what do these things have in common? And what they have in common was she had Googled ugly building.
Oh, really?
This is what you got.
Yeah.
So in terms of your last comment, I think we like to think that was the issue that we're thinking about in the course of that lecture was in terms of value, architects addressing themselves to themselves,
yeah.
And the 99% who are looking at saying, this is like ugly, and how do we, and again, that goes back to, I don't know, paralysis.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a nice way, ugly, but I'll try to bring it out later on.
I think the next thing is to do that next time you're in the Netherlands or you're in Shanghai or what. See what the mix is that you get.
Yeah, no. I mean, interestingly, in Beijing itself, they're totally perplexed. I mean, well, now half the building's burnt now, but by the CCTV building, right? And there's new buildings, the bird's nest there's there, and they sit. And then there's this opera house by Paul Andrea, and this kind of ovaloid blob, and there's this kind of weird CCTV thing. So that the locals, they say there are 3 kind of new buildings. There's a bird's nest, there's a bird's egg, which is the Paul Andrea, and there's a bird's leg. They call the CCTV a bird's leg. But they're completely bemused by the whole thing. And I guess what I find interesting actually about that is that, because I was involved in 2004 with an exhibition of avant-garde architecture in Beijing, and what I discovered quite disconcertingly is they have no concept of avant-garde. In other words, there's no sense of a kind of counterculture that we associate Rem Koolhaas and whatever else with. And as such, you begin to think, well, what are these things? And actually, what you begin to realize is they simply belong to a brand name culture. In other words, it is Rem Koolhaas is Prada or Gucci as far as they're concerned. It's simply a kind of a label. Well, that's changing, of course, and changing very rapidly in China, but it's disconcerting for us architects to find out that actually they haven't really. I thought it was amazing culture. They'd moved from kind of modernism without Charles Jenks into this kind of world of commissioning Herzog de Meuron and Rem Koolhaas, and I thought, what an enlightened culture. But actually, it was done, and they hadn't done it in quite so self-conscious a way as I thought it was. So, anyway, so any other questions? We can wrap it up.
Thanks again.
Thank you.